The Tories love talking about deporting asylum seekers to Rwanda, and they love it when their fights with human rights lawyers make the 6 o'clock news. And that's because with nothing to offer on people's living standards, this, they think, is their only way to avoid electoral oblivion. But might they have miscalculated? Well, this was a pretty stunning moment on Question Time this week.
Is there anyone here who supports sending people to Rwanda?
Good on you.
Do you want to respond to that, Helen, and to what you've heard?
Now or after?
No, just do it now. I'll come to you in a moment, if you forgive me.
Yeah, there's a few things to pick up there.
And I just wonder what you think of the fact that there's no support in the audience for sending asylum seekers to Rwanda.
Now, as I always like to make clear on Question Time, they choose the audience to try and make it representative of the population at large, so lots of those people should have been Tories. So, is the Rwanda policy less popular than Braverman and Sunak think it is? Well, not everyone thinks we should take that clip too seriously. James Johnson used to be a pollster for Theresa May. He tweeted this: "Hey Siri, show me a social desirability effect." Now you're probably saying, James Johnson, a pollster for Theresa May, should we believe this guy? She clearly wasn't someone who was particularly in tune with the public mood. But I do think there probably is something to this. Social desirability bias, it's the idea that when people say they believe something, it might not be because they actually believe it, but because they think other people think it's the right thing to believe. So they're saying they believe it because it thinks that makes them look good. In secret, they might think something else. So in short, many people in that audience might have backed the Rwanda policy, but were simply too embarrassed to admit it in public, and let alone, not just in public, but also on national television. There is, on this issue, some evidence for that. The last time YouGov polled people on the Rwanda policy was last October. So I'll read the question in full because I think it does matter what people are asked. So YouGov asked the people they were surveying, "The government has agreed a deal where some people who have entered Britain to apply for asylum will be flown to Rwanda in Africa for their asylum applications to be processed. If their application is successful, they would be granted asylum in Rwanda and would not be entitled to return to Britain. Do you support or oppose this proposal?" Now, at the time they asked this, 24% of people strongly supported it, 18% tended to support it, only 12% tended to oppose, and 25% strongly opposed. So you can see there, more people supported it in one form or another than opposed it in one form or another. And a much more recent poll from More in Common, so they're a think tank, showed a majority of people still backed sending people to Rwanda, though most thought it was unlikely the policy would work, which is potentially why Labour are going on the workability of it as opposed to the morality of it.
Social desirability bias is quite important in politics. And I think right now, very few people in public are willing to defend the Conservative government on any policy. It takes a very brave person to go out there, if they were on BBC Question Time in the audience, or if there was a Vox Pop conducted by another broadcaster, and they were asked by a journalist, what do you think of Rishi Sunak? What do you think of the Conservatives and their record in government? There would be a trivial number of people, it's probably statistically insignificant, who would say they're doing a great job. I'm so happy with them. I'm definitely going to vote for them next time. Really? And I think this is an outgrowth of that. I just think people publicly don't want to show that they're attaching themselves to a Tory policy. I think obviously the survey data is far more robust. Statistically, that's far more reliable than a room of people. That is not representative necessarily. There are certain psychological effects, which mean people aren't necessarily honest in large groups when others can see what they are claiming to support. So he's right, but at the same time, there's clearly a massive political overhead for the Conservatives if they're so unpopular that people now recognize a public downside in terms of being honest about how you feel about them. There's a great line, which is that, I'm not suggesting we're on the cusp of revolution, if only. But there is a great line, which is, revolutions don't happen when everybody next to you thinks that a revolution is imminent. Revolutions happen when everyone else thinks a revolution is imminent. That again really speaks to the idea of certain psychological biases. And I feel like now, close to everyone is pricing in a Conservative defeat at the next general election. Now, that might not be great news for Labour. We had something similar in the year before 1992. It was a little bit harder for Labour to present themselves as the underdogs in those final few weeks of campaigning. And of course, John Major won in 92. So it's not necessarily, an unmitigated good for Labour. But what I think this shows you now is a default ambivalence amongst the public towards the party of government. We've not had that ahead of a general election in this country for a really long time. I mean, you might say Labour in 2010 I actually don't think it was that bad then. This seems significantly worse now. And when you think that this is the Hail Mary policy of the Conservatives, it's the one that, like you say, is meant to distract from declining high streets, high inflation, high interest rates, rising bills. £2,000 is now the average council tax bill in this country. But we're sending people to Rwanda, and it's not even having the desired effect. I think that says something very important a year out from the next general election.
I'm interested, though, in what you said about revolution, because I think when it comes to voting and, democratic liberal elections, social desirability bias can go in both ways in terms of who it benefits. And I'll explain what I mean. So you're exactly right. When it comes to revolutions, it doesn't so much matter what everyone thinks in their head. It matters what they think everyone else thinks, because there's a collective action problem. You're not going to go and start a revolution or go, wave a placard around in an authoritarian state if you don't think there's hundreds of people who will join you, because you'll be putting yourself in a massive risk. So if there is a social desirability bias against talking about having a revolution, that will go quite a long way to stop a revolution happening. But when it comes to democratic elections in a liberal democracy, it can be the case that no one will admit that they want people sent to Rwanda, but when they get into the voting booth on their own, they tick the box that says conservative. Now, this is the shy Tory. We've talked about this for decades. And it could actually be the case that in a liberal democracy, politicians in a way can benefit from believing something and saying something which people feel embarrassed to admit in public. And one of the reasons is because, that might say, well, everyone else is disagreeing with me, but this politician is saying the truth. Donald Trump did this a lot, say, no one else will admit it, but everyone thinks it. And I think that made him seem like a more authentic politician. The other way it can benefit a politician, if what they're saying is, I suppose, outside the realms of what people see as a socially desirable thing to believe, even if they believe it, is that it doesn't get the scrutiny it might otherwise get. So you saw this with Donald Trump, because no one in 2016 was really willing to stand up and defend Donald Trump's positions. Everyone assumed he was a complete joke, and that meant that he went relatively under-scrutinized. You could say a similar thing in sort of 2015 when people thought Labour were doing much better in the polls than they were. So I think it could be the case that if people genuinely believe that they want people sent to Rwanda, but they won't admit it in public, that could actually be, and I'm not saying this means the Tories are going to win the next general election. I think they're completely screwed. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for a political party to have a position which people agree with, but won't admit publicly they agree with. And that's because voting is a private act. I mean, what do you make of that, Aaron?
No, I think you're very right to highlight the idea of the shy Tory. And I think we agree here, Michael. So there were some people, for instance, on social media who were saying, look, nobody agrees with this policy anymore. The Tory has been found out. The whole country has decided to change their mind on immigration in Rwanda. That's categorically untrue. And that speaks to some of the issues you just talked about. So I don't think we should think that these issues have gone away or voter preference on some of the stuff has gone away. I do think it speaks to something about the political moment. And you can talk about Trump, or you can talk about the Tories before 1992. But right now, Michael, and look, it can change. We are seeing certain polls, Michael, which give Labour a 200-seat lead. I don't think that will happen, by the way. But that's what we're seeing. And so I think when you have the run-up to the 2015 general election, you've got Linton Crosby working for Cameron. It's relatively close, but Labour are looking at a potential majority. Then I think some of the things you're referring to, yes, matter. But the Tories are going to need to reclaim and recapture the narrative to some extent. And if people, that shy Tory thing only works when it's relatively close. So I agree with you to some extent, but I think it's not like 92. It's not like 2015. I think it's a different moment now. And I think actually going back to what you said at the start of this, most people don't think Rwanda is going to happen. Most people don't think. It's just they think it's government virtue signaling. Not that the government won't execute it because the government's necessarily crap. Some of them will be Tory voters, but because it'll be blocked by judges. Somehow the European Union will get involved, or it becomes technically impossible, or whatever. It's just one of those things. There's a great hypothesis in the London Review of Books just after the Brexit referendum, which said that some people voted Brexit precisely because they were so accustomed to nothing changing in politics. They were so accustomed to their vote not really mattering that much that they didn't properly cost the downsides of leaving the European Union. They just said, well, people are saying this stuff, but people say all sorts of things at every election, every plebiscite, and nothing really changes. So on the one hand, you had some people, I don't doubt this for a moment, some people were very energized, wanted to vote for Brexit to change stuff a lot. Some people voted for Brexit because they didn't think anything would change. I do think the Tories need to rally their base. And I think, actually, Michael, final point here is that you do have Reform and all these other people. We have Farage, who are to the right of the Tory party. And I think that shy Tory thing works a little bit less when you have people to their right saying, well, hold on, net immigration 600,000 used to be tens of thousands 13 years ago. Hold on, you say you're hard on law and order, and yet we see XYZ person escaping prison. Hit and run. Somebody kills somebody driving and they go to prison for a year. What's that all about? So I think there's a bit more of a complicated dynamic here, Michael. But as ever, I think Michael Walker's insights, which are perhaps counterintuitive to what progressives are saying on Twitter, I think there's something to it.